Hi, everyone. Welcome to the 2021 Virtual Rohwer and Jerome Pilgrimage. Thank you so much for tuning in this weekend. My name is Erin Aoyama. It is a little bit bittersweet, I think, to gather again virtually, but I'm also so grateful to have this moment to recognize the importance of community and to embrace the ongoing process of learning about our past. In this moment, as our Asian American communities and our Black and Brown communities continue to face violent racism every day, I hope stories from our past, particularly stories of resilience and moments of joy and community strength in the face of white supremacy, can help us on the path to healing, to building solidarity, and ultimately to liberation. We are so excited about the conversations ahead of us this weekend, and we hope that they can serve as the basis for even more learning and conversation about the histories of Japanese American incarceration and Japanese American communities, even while there's so much that we just can't get to this weekend. We hope that you'll learn a few new things this weekend and, of course, come away with more questions. I am personally so looking forward to hearing from so many of our community elders about their memories and reflections from their time at Rohwer or Jerome, or in some cases, both. And I'm also looking forward to taking so much of what I know I'll learn from this weekend forward, to continue thinking critically about race and justice, past and present, in the specific space of Arkansas and the South. Even as we hear so many incredible stories this weekend, I'm also thinking about the voices we've yet to hear or listen to, and I'm holding space for those too. I invite you to join me to continue these reflections and conversations after this weekend. Pilgrimages for me are an important and beautiful opportunity to connect with the past through community. And I'm so grateful to the folks at Japanese American Memorial Pilgrimages, aka JAMP, Kimiko, Marissa, Nicole, Hiro, the whole crew, for the time, the effort, and the love they put into planning these pilgrimages. So thank you so much, JAMP and Kimiko backstage, for doing this. Without further ado, I am so delighted to introduce our first two speakers, Delphine Hirasuna and Marilyn Chase. And I promised I would keep their introductions short. Hi, Delphine. Hi, Marilyn. So I will just say that Delphine Hirasuna is the author of The Art of Gaman, Arts and Crafts from the Japanese American Internment Camps, 1942 to 1946, which she shared some about with us this week, if you haven't checked out her talk. I also just learned, Delphine told me, that a lot of people know her for her cookbook. So maybe that's something your family has encountered. Delphine has had an incredible many careers that we're excited to hear more about. And Marilyn Chase is here as well. Hi, Marilyn. And Marilyn is the author of Everything She Touched, The Life of Ruth Asawa, which she gave a book talk about over the summer during Tadaima, also available on the website. We're so grateful to both of you for being here, and we're so looking forward to hearing this conversation. I'll let you take it away.
Well, I just want to add my thanks to Erin and Kimiko and everyone at the Japanese American Memorial Pilgrimages for inviting us to this wonderful event honoring Rohwer and Jerome pilgrims and their families. Delphine, I remember interviewing you way back in 2017 while I was researching the life of Ruth Asawa, who is another Rohwer alumna. I was so excited to pick your brain as you were the author of The Art of Gaman, Arts and Crafts from the Japanese American Internment Camps, 1942 to 1946. I learned then that you were descended from Rohwer and Jerome survivors, and you also taught me your elegant definition of Gaman: to endure the seemingly unbearable with patience and dignity. And it's something that I've quoted many times since. So thank you for that. So to begin, could you introduce us to the Hirasuna and Sasaki families, your dad's and your mom's people, and talk a little bit about how their lives as California farmers and growers were uprooted and transplanted to Arkansas?
Sure, absolutely. First, I want to say that I'm really honored that Marilyn has agreed to interview me on this, because she has such a great book out that I think everybody should read it. And she's such a thorough journalist that, and just don't do a Woodward and Bernstein on me. But my family, both of them, Rohwer is particularly meaningful to me and my family, because that's where they spent the bulk of the war. The Sasaki side, my mom's side, spent the whole duration of the war in Rohwer. The Hirasunas started out in Jerome, and then when my dad was drafted into the 442nd from Jerome, my mom and my two older brothers and sister moved to Rohwer because they closed Jerome first. And so they moved over there where my mom's parents were. But before the war, my dad's side of the family were based in Fresno, and they were farmers. And my parents had just gotten my brother was 2, so they hadn't just gotten married, but they were still living with them. They did what my mom used to call row crops or low crops. They were raising, onions and, vegetable crops in Fresno. And they, like most families, they rented their property and their farmland. So when the war broke out and they had to go to camp, they of course lost everything because even the new tractor that my dad had just bought, they couldn't take it along with them. But my mother's side of the family, my grandfather, who came to the U.S. early on, they lived in a campo, which is near Sacramento, and he had the first generation, the Issei's, couldn't own land, and so when my uncle was born, his first son was born, he immediately started buying up land in my uncle's name. That was true of several other Issei's. So they had land to come back to. When the war ended and people could come back to California, because my grandfather was one of the few people who had land in that area, he let people come and stay on their property because no one would rent to the Japanese. They didn't have jobs. They didn't, there was a lot of hostility there. People would drive by the house and shoot at the house. So my uncle said that someone actually burned down a house that someone was living in. So there was a lot of fear. And so after the war, my mother, who came back with my 2 older siblings, and they stayed they moved in with my grandparents, but because my grandparents had 6 other kids, and they let as many people as would fit on the farm stay there, my parents were assigned to live in my uncle's dark room. So my older sister remembers that it was really tiny, like a closet, and all 4 of them slept there. Dad didn't come back with, he was in Italy. He was serving in Italy with the 442nd. So when the war ended, my mother came back with my 2 siblings and I think my dad's parents. And what my mom remembered was that when they came back by train, the train made a stop somewhere and she couldn't remember where, but they were afraid to go try to get a hotel room. So they slept in the park. So that was, that was one of Mom's memories. The others was that I think they were going through Salt Lake City and there were Japanese there who were not in internment camps. And she said that the locals would meet the trains knowing that people were going on their way back to California, and they would pack little bento lunches and hand it off to them when the train went by. So she always remembered them fondly. But other than that, it was my dad came back from Italy. I think 9 months before I was born. I was born in 46. So
A peacetime baby.
Yeah, I was just a twinkle in their eyes, as they said. But so I was, I never went into camp. But I know that my brother was 2. My sister was born in Rohwer, and or Jerome, I guess. And my aunt, who on my father's side, said the one memory of them having to evacuate to the Fresno Assembly Center, which was in the fairground, and was that she said when the truck drove them away to take them to camp, the family dog, which the neighbor had agreed to take care of him, started running after the truck. And my brother, who was not quite 2 at that point, was looking out the window and started crying and screaming. The dog's name was Bobby. And my aunt said that when my brother started crying and they saw Bobby running after the truck, everybody in the car started crying. And but the other memory is that Bobby sat by the side of the road every day waiting for them to come home. And finally a truck ran the Bobby over. Mm-hmm. I remember when they got out of camp, I would say, could we get a dog? And Mom would say, no dog. And I kept asking her why. And she said, because it's too hard. It's too hard. And she didn't tell me it's too hard if the dog dies, but that was her reason for why. So those are the only things that my parents talked about or told us about. They never talked about the camps. They never told us what the camps were. We knew they weren't good, but we didn't know exactly the circumstances of why they went into camp or any of that. It was that was my memory of the camps.
Wow, that's an incredible saga that they went to. Can you talk a little bit about how the generations were split up between Rohwer and Jerome and how they coped with that separation?
You mean the Sasaki side went into Rohwer from the beginning. They were living in a campo, and they were sent to the Stockton Assembly Center and then sent to Rohwer. And the Hirasuna side lived in Fresno. Still, a lot of them still do. And so they were sent to Jerome. Jerome and Rohwer were like the last camps that were established. I think initially they were not planning to put Central Valley people in the camps. You know, it was mostly intended for the coastline. But there were a number of reasons why they decided to take everybody in California. So they were, and Rohwer and Jerome were the only 2 places that weren't in the desert. So they were able to, my uncle said that they grew the best watermelons. And so they, but now I forgot your question, Marilyn. Sorry.
Well, you mentioned the watermelons and you mentioned the row crops, the onions and so on. Mm-hmm. And it's such a terrible irony that the very families in the industry that was feeding the country were forcibly removed. Mm-hmm. Can you tell us what happened to the family's land holdings? And because I know that you and your family still hold some farmland and still work that land with orchards. Mm-hmm. So what happened to the family's, basically their growing business?
Most of the Japanese who went into camp, because the first generation could not own land, and they were the ones who were adults, most of it was lost. My grandfather was an exception, where he managed to hang on to his acreage. But the others, my dad had, he said that they had just bought a new tractor and they had to just sort of leave it behind. Before they went into the assembly center, they had just planted the crop, and it was going to be harvested soon. And they had to leave that behind because the notice to go into camp, you got like 10 days, a week to pack up and only take what you could carry. So, there was a lot to do in a very short amount of time. And so they left their crop behind, they left the tractor behind. And when the war, and they put things in storage. And I think my parents arranged with some other families to rent storage in the Buddhist church there. And but of course, the community knew they weren't where they were and that they weren't coming back. And so by the time they got back 3.5, 4 years later, people had ransacked the storage space. And so a lot of things were lost. My mother's side was luckier. They had more, they had the property. The neighbors watched after the property. So they came back to a little bit more than what my dad's side got.
That's incredible. There's so many parallel stories. Ruth Asawa's family also were truck farmers in their instance down in Norwalk near Los Angeles, and they also lost everything, all their farm equipment, the horses, the goodwill from their business, and were not able to hold on to their land holdings and had to start over literally from square one when the war was done. But I wonder if your family ever mentioned in passing the shock of first seeing Rohwer or Jerome with the tar paper barracks and the wooden walkways and those broiling summers and bitter cold winters, the bad food. Since you've said that your mother's family historically going back to Japan were chefs, I wonder how they coped with the mess hall food. That's probably using the word liberally, but it was, I'm sure, a huge culture shock. Did they ever talk about that?
Well, I know that I guess when they first went into camp, or maybe it was the assembly center, they were fed a lot of liver. And I don't think the Japanese ate liver. So they were just grossed out by having a lot of liver dinners. And the one good thing about having so many farmers in camp is that people took seeds of all the things that they packed seeds. So the first several months were rough because they didn't, they had to eat whatever the authorities sent in. But soon they were growing vegetables and as my uncle said, Rohwer grew the best watermelons anywhere. and you look at some of the pictures of the barracks, and a lot of people had gardens growing in the front. And but seeds were one of the key things that people packed to go when they went into camp. They didn't. The interesting thing about the Niseis, the second generation and my parents' generation, is they didn't talk about the camps. They only talked about it in passing. They didn't talk about it to us kids. They probably talked about amongst themselves, but my remembrance of what they talked about when we were growing up was we knew them from camp. We lost that when we went into camp. Everything was divided between before camp and after camp. But until I started writing the book, I never tried to figure out what the camps were. I certainly knew that it wasn't a good place, but I think it was a self-defense mechanism not to try to think about it too much. So when I was growing up, I didn't try to find out the specifics of, what happened in camp. So it was when I was writing the book that I really sort of dove into the research. And I was appalled by what I learned. And by that time, both of my parents had died, so I couldn't ask them about it. I think that after, and that's my one regret, that I couldn't have sat down and just said, okay, tell me what went on. What was your experience? What were you thinking when this was happening? My mother was in her early to mid 20s when she had to go into camp. My dad was, I saw the papers, he was 34 when he went into camp. My mom was one of those people who would be called a kibe. She was born in California. When she was 4 or 5, her parents took her back to Hiroshima because they wanted her to be educated with proper manners and become a proper Japanese woman. And they thought at some point they would be able to go back to Japan. But after that, they had 6 more kids, and none of the other kids could speak Japanese. They couldn't read, they couldn't write, and they certainly didn't want to go back to a country they didn't know. So when my mom was 12 or 13, they sent for her. She came back to California, and she went to school. They sent her to grammar school for 3 years when she was a teenager. That must have been hard because she was just learning how to read and write. And so when they went into camp, the kibes were, they sort of fell between the cracks. The people who really wanted to identify with, or did identify with America, looked upon them with some suspicion. And they, so I think my mother's experience and my dad's experience was like somewhat, it was different because my mom still had memories of Japan, and she spoke with an accent, and which, most of the Niseis didn't. And the Niseis who were, the average age of the Niseis in camp was 17. So, there were like 6,000 children born in camp, including my older sister. And so they didn't know any other world. And when they had the teenagers had dances, they had baseball games, they lived the all-American life. When I guess some of their parents, the Issei's, allowed them to name the streets between the barracks, they would give it, Benny Goodman Drive or whatever. They were all American. They were, they really they had never been to Japan, so they didn't identify with what was going on there. But for the kibes, my mother's generation, they sort of fell between the cracks there. So.
Well, I remember that you told me at our first meeting, we talked almost all day until the sun went down, but you mentioned that it was
fun.
This fact that it was considered somewhat impolite to ask your elders about the war years, and many people use the expression, they swallowed their suffering. Mm-hmm. So I wonder if you have thoughts, given all that you have learned through your own research and over time through your book, if you have thoughts on how children and grandchildren can open up these discussions with their elders.
Well, I think now that the elders today, the Issei's, the first generation, and who were adults then, they were the ones who suffered most. They were the ones who lost their property, their, everything. When the war ended, they came back to nothing. And they were also treated with suspicion and hostility when they went back home. My parents' generation and the Niseis who are alive today, they're all in their 80s, 90s. You know, I have a friend who's 103. And so, but what their memories of the camp were not as grim as what happened to the Iseis, because they were able to restart their life if they could find some sponsor outside of the camps. They could get permission to leave. I think that's what happened to Ruth. She was able to go to Black Mountain College. So, you know, they, in some ways, I think they were allowed opportunities that maybe they wouldn't have had Ruth continue to live on a farm in Southern California. And so they do not have the same memories that the Iseis would have. But the Niseis didn't talk about the camps to us, their children, that's at least not with, and I think partly they didn't want to burden us with what happened. And they didn't want us to be bitter toward toward our classmates or anything, and they wanted to forget. So, you know, what any discussions was amongst themselves, and they didn't say much. And I was always mad because I was sort of when I was like 14 or something, they would have these dances at the Buddhist church. And I would go there, and they would always have hamburgers and spaghetti. And I would say, you know, they're trying to out the Americans, you know, what happened to the sushi and what happened to, and so there was a need to say, you know, we're American, and see, we know how to make spaghetti and hamburgers. So at that time, I remember complaining to my mom that this is, you know, the kinds of things they served and the way they wanted to blend in and show that we were Americans just like everybody else, and that's the one memory I have of that period.
Right. You told me once a really wonderful story about how you, in the course of some professional travel, just happened upon the site that you learned was Rohwer. Can you share that with
us? That's sort of funny. When I went to work, I got a job at Potlatch Corporation, and they have a paperboard mill in Rohwer. And, you know, in Rohwer, even today, I think their population is, I don't know if it exceeds 1,000 people. And I was looking at the map of where they had paperboard mills or mills, and I noticed that it said Rohwer. So I called my mom and I said, I took a job at this place, and they have a mill in a town called Rohwer. Is that close to where the camps were? And I met with absolute silence. She said, you haven't listened, have you? Rohwer is where the camp was. And I said, but you always said Lower. You know, because she talked to my grandmother, and the R's often became L's. And so I always thought it was called Lower. And so she was, and that's how I found out that my parents were in Rohwer, not Lower.
That's amazing. You know, for folks who are in a delicate situation, perhaps with some relatives who are shy about sharing memories. I know we've talked about all of the wealth of resources that the National Archives and Records Administration, which I believe keeps files on even folks who were children or teenagers, as Ruth Asawa was when she was relocated to Rohwer. You can, many of these files are digitized. You can have them sent to you. And also the Densho Encyclopedia Online has some amazing Rohr resources. For example, that's where I found some of the issues of the Rohr Outpost, the camp newspaper that is just full of anecdotes and experiences and descriptions that give the flavor of daily life. So some people might enjoy researching that. And of course, your book on camp crafts shows people's creativity shining through even during incarceration. And I remember you talked about, you write of the Issei, arts and crafts became their escape, their survival, their passion. And in my book, Ruth Asawa said something very similar. She said, art saved us. Can you talk a little bit about art as survival?
It's interesting that the suggestion to start an arts program in camp originated with a man called Chiro Obata, and he was an artist. He in Berkeley. He taught at UC Berkeley. He taught, and when the camps happened and it became inevitable that people were going to have to go into camp, he went to the authorities and said, let me start an art class, art school, because, you take 120,000 people out of their daily surroundings and put them in these remote places with nothing to do. If they're going to get restless, and let me start some classes and things. So before people even left the assembly center, there were art classes going, sewing classes. I know somebody who was taking a fashion design class of some kind, and they were taught by other internees, and so whatever they knew how to do, they taught each other. And so art was not. It was a way to, I think, to pass the time, number one, but also to keep your own sense of identity and self-expression. Because when you were put in the camps, you lost all control over your own, your own daily life. And this was something where they could get lost in painting and in sculpturing and doing. So every single person from preschool on to the elderly, they created things. It was and they did it with a real passion, because this was the only thing they had to really express their own personality, their own, and it also was a release, I think. So what was amazing about what was produced in camp was these people, some of the artwork that I saw were just absolutely blew me away, because I knew these people before they went into camp or after they came out of camp, and most of them were farmers. And then you see these amazing things they created. And but when they had time, when they were stuck in this area of 1 square mile, and this is all they could do, and they stayed focused on it like every day, there was some amazing artwork that came out of it. And what really what was sort of depressed me was that when they came out and I asked people, so did they continue with their art? It was no, we had to make a living. They went back to being farmers and gardeners. I went to there was one artist who was pretty well known in camp or after camp, and his work was featured in some books. But I said, and someone called me and said, you might want to go there's an estate sale in Berkeley. You might want to go over there. And I went over there, and the whole house was loaded with things that this man made in camp. And but he was a gardener in Berkeley, and several artists like that, even if they studied art before they went into camp, when they came out, they couldn't find jobs. And so they, there was one man who, became a butler in New York. They so many of them couldn't they couldn't continue with their artwork. And so those 3.5 years were the only time when they really focused on art, and some amazing things came out of that period.
Well, that's wonderful. Just a wonderful recollection, and thank you so much for sharing that. Maybe this would be a good moment for Erin to rejoin us and see whether we have any questions from the audience. Erin, are you there?
Yes. Hello. This has been so wonderful. And I've heard a little bit of some of these stories this week as we've been talking about this panel, but this is just wonderful. This is a good reminder, folks watching along, please leave any questions or anything you might want to ask Delphine or Marilyn in the chat, and I will ask for you. But I think while we're waiting for some questions from the audience, I have a couple questions for both of you, if that's okay. Delphine, you sort of started talking about this, and Marilyn, you did as well, with talking about how folks can go about doing this kind of research, whether it's about their families or otherwise. But I'm wondering, Delphine, if you could talk about the experience of trying to research your own family, and what that felt like for you, what kinds of questions you were asking, and sort of the process of coming to write a book that is both about your family and also, about so many other families.
Well, I never thought about this subject. I was writing a weekly column for the Hokube Mainichi and the Rafu Shimpo, were the two West Coast newspapers. But mostly I wrote little humorous pieces about my grandmother and some of the quirky, Japanese things that they did. And I sort of teased my mother and her friends for some of the things they did. But the camps was something that I never thought about. And it wasn't really until my mom died and I found this bird pin in the garage. And it was really, I was roaming around the garage, sort of looking around. I happened to see this box in the nook in the garage, and it was dusty and it looked like it hadn't been touched in 50 years. My parents moved onto the property where we still have the property in 1949. So they probably, right after the war, they probably unpacked, and things they didn't really want to think about, they stuck in the garage. And so this was in a wooden box in the garage, in a nook. And I opened up the box, and I found, I don't know if anybody could see it, this bird pin. And I was looking at it and I thought, oh, this is pretty cool. So I started wearing it. And a friend of mine, who's the designer who did my book, asked me where it came from. And I said, I think it came from camp. I vaguely remember. And he asked me, I give him credit for starting the idea of the book. He said, so what else was made in camp? And that's what started me on this journey. I started asking around and asking. And at first, and my memory of what things made in camp were pretty cheesy. I remember a shell ornament that was set on the living room coffee table, and it was this bouquet polished with nail polish. And even at 8, I thought it was pretty hokey. But then when people started showing up and showing me what they had, and I realized that there's just, the variety was pretty amazing. And then I started seeing things like there was a poetry, haiku writing class, and calligraphy, and all these men were writing, poetry or haikus or whatever they call it, and they were, it caused me to start thinking well, I certainly reevaluated the essays. Like these people who came back from the war and primarily were really poor at that point. And then I saw all these examples of poems they wrote in camp, and they were really quite poignant. And, it made me realize that I really didn't know their true character, they were, what they did. And when I saw some of the art pieces that people were handing over to me, and they were pulling it out of their shed. I remember borrowing some carved burned wood made in Rohwer, and they took it out of their shed. And when I photographed it and returned it to them, they threw it back in the shed, and the shed burned down. So they don't have any more of them. But this is how much they didn't want to remember it. They didn't display it. If they kept it at all, it was not kept. It wasn't well preserved. A lot of things were thrown away. A lot of things were. The book really caused me to reevaluate not only who realize that I didn't know who they were or understand the spirit of these people, my family, their friends, and also to ask myself, the average person, if they are left on their own and they have the time for 3 years, what do they create? Some of these things were really so amazingly beautiful, and they weren't made by professional artists. And there were people like Isamu Noguchi who were in camp, and there are some people who were quite good and went on, and Ruth Asawa, who was just 17 when she was in Rohwer, but who went on to successful careers. But by and large, the people who came out of camp, even if they had aspired originally to become artists, weren't able to get back into that profession. But the things that they created and left behind, or it's really inspiring, and it really makes me wonder what the average person has inside them. What if left? I can't draw a straight line, but I thought, if I were in camp and every day I did, what would I have produced? What kind of, could I have unleashed some creativity that I'm not aware of now? And so, I came to admire what they did, and also question, what sort of feeds the human spirit. How do we nourish ourselves, and how do we, and so the book was very, very good for me. It really caused me to reevaluate a whole lot of things. So.
Yeah, that's so interesting, Delphine, to hear you talk about this, because it brings up so many questions and important just sort of reminders about doing this kind of history, that the art that we see and the art that you highlight in your book is so important for reminding us about the complexities and the humanity of camp. But then this idea that the people the artists themselves maybe didn't want to look at this afterwards. It wasn't the same kind of beautiful reminder. Right.
I think for every object brought back, a lot more was left behind at the camp, thrown away.
Yeah.
Because when I saw the artwork, the drawings, the watercolors, they were done on scrap paper. There was a beautiful painting that was done on the inside of a cereal box. Right. So a lot of, and the wood carvings, they were not pure fine wood. They picked up scrap wood, and so these people didn't think that what they created had any value, and so they left it behind, or they threw it in the shed if they brought it back at all. And people told me when the book came out, oh, we used to have that, but I threw it away. And one woman said, oh, one day I was helping my dad clean up, and I found a whole box of bird pins in the garbage can. And she said, "What is this, Dad?" And he said, "Oh, that's just junk that we did in camp. Throw it away."
Mm.
So, there's a lot of that. A lot of things are being discovered in thrift shops, and so even today, now I get probably once a week, someone sends me a picture of something they think was from camp, and when I ask where it came from, they would say, "Oh, I found it in a thrift shop. I found it." And so these were, definitely, and the other thing I would say is they're not well taken care of. I have one. I'm pleased that the descendants have hung on to things their grandparents made, but you can't display it and let the sun, it fade in the sun. The wood cracks. There's so many pieces where the wood cracks because it was displayed in the wrong, in the window where the sun could dry out the wood. Shell pins, they're brittle, they crack. So the one, if people have things, I would urge them to take care of them. The museums know how to preserve them, and and climate control them. So I think that's yeah. Anyway, sorry.
And I'm just, I think that's so interesting to think about. And I just asked Kimiko, I'm pretty sure during Tadaima over the summer, we had a session from Kristen Hayashi, who's one of the curators at JANM, about caring for some of these objects. So if we can dig that up, I'll ask Kimiko to put it in the chat in case some folks watching have objects at home that they'd like to take care of. So Delphine, I want to give you a break from talking for a minute and ask you a question, Marilyn, because we've talked a little bit around, Ruth and your work on Ruth Asawa. I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit about Ruth's life at camp. And I'm asking you to do a very short version of this, but we've talked about, the art that Delphine has encountered that was created at Rohwer and Jerome and elsewhere. And I'm wondering what Ruth's life as an artist was at Rohwer. I know this was sort of before she officially began her professional life, but I know you have so many amazing stories.
Well, that's exactly right. This was before her life as a professional artist, but it was a time when she had the ability to give her energies to making art. When she was a young girl, one of 7 on the farm, she was expected, like all good children of hardworking farmers, to lend her hand in the fields before school, after school, on weekends, and even holidays. When she arrived in Rohwer, along with the culture shock, of course, there was also a bit of a respite from farm chores. So she was able to, encouraged by her high school teachers, and where she was able to paint and draw. She did watercolors of the barracks reflected in the bayous. She did a famous watercolor of a sumo match, which was one of the sports that was encouraged. She also sketched her entire high school graduating class because cameras were forbidden as contraband. So she did wonderful caricature sketches of her entire high school class. I might just pick up, there's a question from the chat from Fred Tanaka, who this sort of links into Ruth's story. He says, how were they able to get art supplies? Did they have to make do with what they had? Or were they able to request supplies? And I'm sure Delphine has some observations about this too, but in Ruth's case, in her high school class, in the beginning, they had nothing that resembled a classic art supplies, no paper, canvas for painting, proper paints. So their art teacher would get anything that she could get her hands on served as art supplies. Old surplus denim became a canvas for painting. Buttons, leftover buttons became craft materials or materials for jewelry. And gradually she made this art teacher who was Caucasian, who really wanted to give her students the best that she could, made a special request or requisition and did get her hands, I think, on some proper art supplies. But it was very tough. And she saved all the things that her students did. I believe some of them may be in the museum that Miss Rosalie Gould, the former mayor, pulled together. But that was the good side. Ruth Asawa, like many of her generation, didn't really talk in public very much about the more somber side of camp. She eventually told the story of her generation in bronze when she created the Japanese American Internment Memorial, which today is in San Jose, California, by the federal courthouse. It's a double-sided bas-relief 5 by 14-foot wall that has scenes of the camp life. And so she let her art tell the story for her.
Yeah.
The one thing, in my second book, All That Remains, there's a watercolor that Ruth did in camp. Her teacher, I don't know whether it was Rosalie or Miss Jameson who was the art teacher, but found the painting and sent it to Ruth. And so Ruth had it. And when I was doing a show and I asked her son, did Ruth do anything in camp that I could borrow? And so so they let me borrow this watercolor, and it really shows her talent. But the other thing is, when I went to Little Rock to the Butler Center, which if you haven't gone, you should go, because that's where they have all these things from Rohwer. And I saw other watercolors done by the class that Ruth was in, and all of the paintings were the same thing. I mean, they're different levels of skill, but it must have been a class assignment. They went out to the bayou, and so Ruth had painted this picture of the bayou, and there were probably 10 more there to look at that were, along the same lines. So that was true of a lot of artwork. You saw things, they had these classes, and there's taught by internees, and people did the same subject. And you see wood carvings, if you see one with one subject, you might see 4 more. So, and the level of skill differed, but still but they were dependent on scrap and finding materials. The shell pins, certainly from Tule Lake and Topaz, were, they just picked up the shells from the ground. Arkansas was known for its wood, and they had these what they call kobu, these in the cypress swamps. They had these protrusions that grew from the ground, and kobu hunting became quite a sport, and people would volunteer for the firewood gathering to go out into the swamps to chop firewood, and so but it was really found materials. After a while, the camp store, sort of a general store, would bring in things and they would get materials that people could go buy, but no one had any money. So, if you bought it, it was not fancy stuff. They didn't, you never saw, it was also usually pretty small. Because the bird pins were popular because it didn't take much wood, and you could use just a pocket knife to carve it, and you could just use paint to paint this little square of wood. But so that's the other thing is that because people were not prepared for the climate, 8 of the camps were in deserts, and 2 of them in Arkansas were in sort of swampy areas. And the people came from the West Coast where the climate was milder. And, but they didn't bring the right clothes. So they were knitting knitting groups that started up among the ladies. And so people learned to knit clothes, knit things for themselves. They learned crocheting. And so it was both necessity and distraction. So.
Yeah, and I think about that with my own grandma, who never talked about her time in camp, but she was always knitting. And so the more, and my memories of her, so the more that I've learned about camp, the more I've sort of realized that that was a piece that she probably brought with her from camp. And knit all of the sweaters my dad grew growing up, and a lot of the sweaters my siblings and I wore as kids. Well, we are fast approaching the end of our hour, and I'm so grateful to both of you for this wonderful conversation. And it's honestly led so nicely into our next session, which I'll get to in a moment. But we do have another question from the audience that I want to leave us with, which is from Paul Lanier, who says, how can we purchase the Art of Gaman? And are you in contact with craftspeople in your community?
Bless you, Paul. Paul is Ruth Asawa's son and a wonderful artist himself. You could purchase my book still from Amazon, both Art of Gaman and All That Remains. If I don't know if Paul has a copy. If he doesn't, I will get you one, Paul. Ruth, in the book on Ruth, which I highly recommend, I wrote the endorsement on the back of the book, and I think it's available anywhere now, isn't it? It's because Art of Gaman has been out since 2005, so it's mostly just online through. But the Ruth book is, I think it's in all the bookstores, isn't it still, Marilyn?
Pretty much. We just celebrated its first anniversary, so it's available online and at independent bookstores, or if you don't live near one, bookshop.org is an entity that supports and encourages, and I believe contributes to independent bookstores with the purchase price. So that's another venue.
That's great. Thank you both. Thank you so much. And I know to folks watching, we didn't get to all of your questions, and I'm sorry about that, but thank you for engaging with us. Thank you, Delphine and Marilyn, for sharing so much about your work, and Delphine about your family. I would encourage folks watching to tune in an hour. We have another session that's talking about the Rosalie Gould and Mabel Jamison Vogel collection with Heather Zbinden down in Arkansas. So please join us. And thank you again so much, Delphine and Marilyn, for your time and for sharing so much of your work and stories with us.
Thank you.
Thank you. It's fun. Bye.